Hello all. I am working today with chapter 21, which is the establishment of an American empire. America becomes an imperial power. So, a couple basic questions here. How and why, from being a very isolated country, do we become a worldwide power? And the answer is right around 1900, and we have stayed that way since then. We are still the world's, I guess, dominant political and economic power at the moment. And this happens about 1900. Okay. The other half of this equation is how does gaining this empire change America drastically and permanently? So it works in both directions. There is a shift from about 1900, shift in American views, and this changes how we view ourselves and our role in the world. We become the world's superpower long before the last 10 years, 20 years. This was about 1900. Before this point, we were involved, of course, with settling the West, with building economic power. We were very internal. We did not look outward. In fact, our Secretary of State said just a year before the Spanish-American War, our relations with foreign nations excite very little interest. That changed after about 1900. So we need some definitions first here. And the first is the term manifest destiny, which was used really from the 1840s. So destiny, of course, is karma, is your future, it's your plan. Who's in charge of your destiny? Not you, God. So manifest means clear to all. So clear to all, it was America's destiny, America's fate to become a world power, to expand from coast to coast and beyond it. And I'm quoting again a high politician in America. Does it not look as if God were not preparing in our Anglo-Saxon civilization the die with which to stamp the peoples of the earth? Other races have felt the same way, but this is America's turn in 1900. So destiny, manifest destiny, was used to justify our taking over roughly half of Mexico in the 1840s. The term changes to imperialism, and imperialism is the hashtag for creating an empire, empire and imperialism being the same thing. The difference is, of course, that when you have an empire, it involves non-contiguous territory, things that don't necessarily touch your own. Up until 1898, we had only taken territory that touched our own, the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican War cession. We had expanded into the Ohio Valley before then, the Northwest, the Oregon area. All of this touched our previous territory. Now we are getting into territory that no longer touches ours. And imperialism, and it's become a nasty term really in the last 50 years, is a political system, a government, which a more powerful country, usually an industrial nation, uses undeveloped areas to provide raw materials for their own industries. When we're done taking these raw materials and turning them into manufactured goods, we turn around and we sell the manufactured goods back to the countries that gave us the raw materials. So there's a power difference here, more powerful controlling less powerful countries. Almost always now used as a negative term. The theft of resources, if you watched that movie a couple years ago, Blood Diamonds, is a good example of this. But it is a two-way street in some respects. The mother country, the more powerful country, gets resources, but the less powerful one gets protection. Sometimes they get education and healthcare too, sometimes not, depends. The assumption is that the advantage is to the more powerful country. Not always. What happens if it costs so much to control and to get the assets out of this less powerful country that you actually lose money on the deal? This happened to Britain systematically. She at one point owned a third of all the territory on the earth, and lost money on everything except for one colony that Britain had, and the one that she actually made money on were the North American colonies. Lost money in India, lost money in Southeast Asia, lost money in Africa because wars occur, and then that costs a lot of money. So basically, the arrangement is you're trading resources for protection, but the country getting the resources doesn't always end up ahead. So you really have to look case by case. Okay, so what are we doing here? What are the causes of this, and why all of a sudden are we looking outward? First of all, we have no place left to expand. We've hit the Pacific Ocean. We've gotten Oregon, we've gotten California. The population is still growing by leaps and bounds. We talked about 1 million people a year in the immigrant chapter. We need more space, or so the feeling was. We also have faster transportation and communication. We have the telegraph. We have the beginnings of the telephone. We certainly have 5 transcontinental railways. We now have steamships instead of sailing ships. So it was much faster to get places. The world looked a lot smaller. If you remember, with a sailing ship, it took 2 to 3 months to get to England from America, or vice versa. Now, you could make the same trip in 12 to 14 days. So it doesn't seem quite so daunting that things are as far away. They seem to be closer. You also, if you are having a worldwide trade and commerce, need bases to repair, to reload, to fix your ships as well. So that's another factor here. This huge economic boom that we talked about, factories cranking out stuff, we very clearly, by the time of World War I, are producing more than we can consume. America factories are just cranking out the stuff. The population is buying some, but we are cranking out more than people can buy here. So we're looking for a trading empire. We're looking for other places to sell our goods, frankly. Other factors, I think, is clearly social Darwinism. If it works with individuals within a country, it was applied also between nations. Strong nations will survive, and they will swallow up their weaker neighbors or other weaker countries, just like lions eat slow gazelles on the African plains. If it worked for individuals, it would work for nations. And clearly, this is undisguised racism at the time. Social Darwinism assumed that the Anglo-Saxon race, Western and Northwestern Europeans, were superior. They had a superior religion in Protestantism, and a superior culture, and a superior economic system in capitalism. Rudyard Kipling, who was a British employee, British Army in India, exactly at this time, wrote it about India, but it applies everywhere. He wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden. Let me read you a few lines from it, because it is a perfect description of the mindset in the early 1900s. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, unfluttered folk and wild, your new-caught, sullen people, half devil and half child. The rest of the world, according to Britain, were a combination of half devils, evil, and children that must be taken care of by the superior Anglo-Saxon race. This was the mindset at the time. Okay, so where do we go? Slides 2 to 5 show you exactly where we went. And the first place we move, we always go west. From the time of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, we have always looked west. Once we hit the Pacific Ocean, we keep looking west. The first place we got, and this is much earlier actually, I don't care about the date, but 1867, right after the Civil War, we bought Alaska, which most people thought was absolutely ridiculous. It was called Seward's Folly. Seward was our Secretary of State who arranged the purchase. It was called an icebox. What do we need with Alaska? We have way too much land, and it's all frozen anyway. We looked at it. Why did we buy it? Basically because it was cheap and Russia wanted to sell. Why did Russia want to sell? What was possibly in Alaska that Russia was there for? The next slide shows you Furs. Cold weather produces very luxuriant furs. And the fur of particular value was that cute little adorable sea otter. Sea otters are not river otters. Sea otters are my size. They're over 5 feet tall. It's a nice, good sized pelt. And if you took them from Alaska into China to sell, in the Chinese market, where they were restricted to the nobility and the royal families, they would sell for $1,000 a pelt. So if you had 200 otter furs, and I don't even want to get into the horrible ways that the Russians caught them and trapped them, it's really gruesome stuff, you could retire for life. You had $200,000, which was the equivalent of millions then. So Russia had just finished the Crimean War. She was broke. Russia's always involved in warfare with other European countries. The Russian Tsar needed money, and he offers to sell Alaska. Our Secretary of State buys it. Congress voted on it. They actually approved it. Congress has to vote on territory. There was nobody there, no Americans there. If there were any, they were a handful. So what do you do with it? You left it alone for a very long time. When do they find gold in Alaska? Not until right before 1900. So we bought it as an icebox. And the furs were pretty gone by that time. Why did we buy it? It was a good deal. It was totally useless at the time. The other territory that we acquire much later, 1893, is Hawaii. Americans had been in Hawaii for a long time, slides 4 and 5. We had American sailors, whaling ships, missionaries had come to try and convert the natives, and what they did with the natives is spread measles. Measles was the killer in Hawaii and wiped out half of the native population that, of course, had no resistance to measles. So what happens with Hawaii? Americans move in, other people move in, but a lot of Americans, and it becomes wall-to-wall sugar plantations. Why do we want Hawaii? We were sugar junkies for a long time. 99% of the exports of sugar produced in Hawaii went to the United States. This is one of our main sources of sugar. The other factor that makes Hawaii very valuable, as you know, why the Japanese bombed it, was Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, if you look at the Pacific Ocean, there are very few good size, large, deep water harbors. Most of the islands in the Pacific are tiny little coral atolls. They are not suitable for big ships. Hawaii had one of the few large ports in the Pacific. So 1890, there are 40,000 Hawaiians. There are 30,000 Asians that were brought in to help work the sugar fields, primarily Chinese, and only 2,000 Americans. 1891, the Hawaiian native queen, Queen Lilikulani, I don't care about her name, basically had a kind of revolution and replaced the American controlling government in a revolt, basically. The American reaction was to fight back. They threw her in jail. They retook the government, placed Americans back in the government, talked to the United States, and requested the U.S. government to annex Hawaii and grant U.S. citizenship to Americans in Hawaii. Again, our Secretary of State at the time said, quote, "We need Hawaii a great deal more than we did California," which was not true, and he continues, I'm quoting him, "It is manifest destiny." It was our destiny to take Hawaii. If you look at the Pacific Ocean, this is a pretty large area. It's a really good idea to have a way station halfway across, which is what Hawaii was used for decades. So how did we retake Hawaii? We landed 150 men, basically, reestablished the American-controlled government, and sent a request for annexation to the Senate, which approved it, and the Pacific started to be called America's Lake. Manifest destiny. It was annexed 1898. The man, the American who led the takeover of the Hawaiian government, was a man named, surprisingly, Dole, D-O-L-E. If that sounds familiar, it should. They weren't into pineapples then, but they sure were into sugar. And almost all of our sugar at that point came from Hawaii. So we need Hawaii for a number of reasons. The next slide, number 6, moves into the Spanish-American War. So we have Alaska, we have Hawaii, but we're still looking west. The Spanish-American War was instigated over Cuba. If you look at Cuba, it is still an issue today. In fact, it's an issue in this election, which we'll talk about in the 1950s, because a lot of Cubans left Cuba and settled in, big surprise, Miami. So Cuba is 92 miles from Florida. Actually, it's only about 50 miles from the end of the Florida Keys. What do we care about Cuba? It is wall-to-wall sugar plantations. Remember, we produce almost none of our sugar in America, very little of it. What had happened in Cuba was, again, a spontaneous revolt of the Cuban people, the peasants, who were not slaves but worked very similar to the conditions of slaves on very large estates owned by wealthy Spanish, oftentimes absentee landlords. Some of them were also owned, some of these plantations were also owned by Americans as well. The peasants led the revolt, but the Spanish, Cuba was still Spanish territory, held out in their forts. They had fortified spots and did not give up, and this turned into a nasty, vicious guerrilla war with hit-and-run attacks, with atrocities on both sides, with massacres and torture on both sides. The Spanish tried to move all the peasants into towns so they could control them. These became like prison camps. Everybody was dying of famine, of disease. Both sides escalated the conflict, and this is a nasty, brutal, vicious war that goes on for several years, and we are 92 miles away from it. So one of the reasons that we get into the Spanish-American War actually is humanitarian, to help the poor, abused Cuban people under Spanish rule. So there is a humanitarian motive here. Yellow journalism is also a term for this. This is certainly a contemporary event. The name Yellow came from a character in cheap newspapers called the Yellow Kid. What sells newspapers? War is good news and sells newspapers. The man key in this event was William Randolph Hearst, who was a big newspaper guy, kind of like Rupert Murdoch is today. He had just moved into the New York City market, which was the biggest in the country, and he needed to sell papers to compete. So you start seeing headlines in Hearst newspapers, and if you want a good picture of William Randolph Hearst, there is one of the most famous movies in American history. A senior moment, I forgot the name, I'll come back to it. Anyway, that's based on his life. You see headlines like, Spanish troops beat prisoners to death. Possibly true. Spanish troops feed prisoners to sharks. That was not true. Another headline, blood on the roads, blood in the fields, blood, blood, blood. You can tell what's going on. Got to sell newspapers, but you're also stirring up the public with, and this is clearly fake news. Okay, so this is a contemporary issue as well. Writers are sent, and artists, because photography was still very difficult to get, moving photography. So they sent artists, illustrators, down to Havana to watch what is going on, to report on the war. Americans are down in Havana. Everything was fairly quiet, not too much going on. One of the artists, Frederick Remington, who was sent down there, telegrammed back to Hearst, everything quiet, no trouble here. There will be no war. I wish to return. Send me home. I'm sitting around drinking pina coladas in Havana. And the return telegram, we have both of these, from Hearst. Please remain. You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. So to some extent, the Spanish-American War, certainly getting public support for it, was a manufactured war. It was a created war with fake news with propaganda literature. Another cause of the war, clearly social Darwinism. Many politicians were pro-war. The public agreed with them, partly manipulated and partly they agreed with them. I'm quoting one politician at the time: "This country needs a war. Only bankers and maniacs want peace at any price." Teddy Roosevelt, later president in 1901, "I should welcome almost any war because I think this country needs one." Why would a country need a war? Think about social Darwinism. You become strong, it strengthens a country, the strong survive and swallow up the weak. And don't forget, Cuba is producing wall-to-wall sugar. 2 weeks later, the Maine, a U.S. battleship destroyer, arrives in Havana Harbor to protect our journalists, to protect American sugar plantation owners. We have a lot of citizens in Cuba. 2 weeks after it arrives, and 1 week after the telegram that Hearst sent, the Maine explodes at night. It kills 260 of the 350 sailors on board instantly. And you can see the drawing of the explosion that was printed in the Hearst papers the next day. In one drawing in a magazine of this event, they actually show a bomb on the Maine. Real facts: nobody knew why it blew up. It sank immediately to the bottom of the harbor. It has been raised in the last 20 years. And what we found when we raised the remains of the Maine is that the explosion did not come from outside. It was not attacked by Spanish torpedoes, as far as we know. The explosion came from inside the Maine and exploded outward. Possibility of sabotage, there is no way to know today what caused that, but the Maine was carrying munitions and armaments in its hold. So it could have been accidental as well. We will never know. The immediate result, of course, is that McKinley, who was our president at the time, immediately goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war. He personally was against a war. I'm quoting McKinley: "I could not have told you where those damn islands were in 1,000 miles," for the Philippines, which was also involved with this. But Congress votes for war. Actually, they voted to, quote unquote, help Cuba. And McKinley says again, all these patriots don't know if the Philippines are islands or canned fruit. But war is a good thing at the time. When we went into Cuba, we also passed, along with that, to quiet the people who were against the war, the Teller Amendment. And the Teller Amendment is a very interesting one because it says that the United States has no permanent interest in Cuba. We are just there to help the poor, downtrodden Cuban people. So the war in Cuba is part of the initial part of the Spanish-American War. A perfect hashtag for it: this is a splendid little war. The whole thing lasts 113 days. Really, there is only 10 days of actual combat, of actual battle. Call goes out for volunteers to enlist. 220,000 enlist very quickly, almost all of them being Southerners. We send 48 ships. 17,000 troops are landed in Cuba, and we invade Cuba to push out the Spanish and free the poor downtrodden Cuban people, quote unquote. Our total battle casualties, again, splendid little war, total battle casualties were 379. 25% of those who volunteered to go were called smoked Yankees. There's a photograph down there of them. They were African Americans who voluntarily enlisted in the U.S. Army. So the U.S. Army invades Cuba. We were darn lucky. First of all, that Spain was an old, decrepit world power. She was even less prepared and organized than we were, because it would have been a disaster if, for example, Britain or France had owned Cuba. The public is almost completely for this. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, became the battle cry. Yellow journalism. The press is completely for it. It sells newspapers and magazines. And battle is very confused, very disorganized. We landed a bunch of troops at a place on the Cuban island called Guantanamo Bay. Sound familiar? Then we went overland, marched overland to a small town called Daiquiri. Sound familiar? And from there marched to take Santiago, the major city in Cuba, that in Havana. The Spanish fleet was immediately bottled up in Santiago Harbor by the American Navy. And in order to take Santiago, we had to take a small fortress on a hill that was guarding Santiago. That hill was called San Juan Hill. And you have a wonderful picture on slide 13, I think it's probably in your textbook too, of Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders charging up San Juan Hill. This is the first time we see Teddy Roosevelt. It was a very flattering portrait of Teddy Roosevelt. When war was declared, Teddy Roosevelt was a fairly young man, and he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He immediately resigned and went to Congress and begged for, put me in charge of a regiment. Give me a regiment. Congress technically appointed an Army officer named Leonard Wood. That should sound familiar too. He was commander, and Teddy Roosevelt was supposed to be underneath him, his subordinate, number 2 man. But Teddy Roosevelt kind of took over the command. He is 39 years old. He has 6 kids at the time, and he is quoted publicly as saying, "I would have turned away from my wife's deathbed to answer the call of battle." It tells you something about Teddy Roosevelt right away. He recruited on his own 1,000 men in San Antonio. You had to be able to ride, you had to be able to shoot, so think about who's going to respond to Teddy Roosevelt's announcements. A lot of cowboys, basically, and he had some cowboy connections. He had a ranch in South Dakota. Also in this group, and I'm not making this up, are 200 polo players from New York, because they're very good horsemen. Other cavalry units were organized, but the horses were not sent over in all of the confusion of this invasion. Teddy Roosevelt hijacked a transport boat and got his horses over. So he's the only group in Cuba that has actual horse cavalry, very photogenic. He was only in 2 battles, and San Juan Hill, he took 400 troops to charge that hill. There were only 100 Spaniards in the fort, so it wasn't exactly an even contest. And he promoted himself. Newspapermen widely copied this and advertised it all over America. When the Spanish-American War has gotten over, everybody knows the name of Teddy Roosevelt. So, 379 in battle total in that 113 days, but another 1,400 die of disease and other causes. Spain only lost 150 in battle. Among our casualties were hundreds of American Army soldiers who died of food poisoning because we sent them with canned meat from our own Army stocks. The meat had botulism in it, and we poisoned our own troops accidentally. So this is amazing that we actually won Cuba. It was mismanaged, it was haphazard, it was not very well organized, very high casualties due to disease, primarily malaria, and food poisoning, very few in battle. The British Prime Minister said God has a special providence for little children, dogs, drunks in the United States of America. We were just darn lucky. So we take Cuba. And the question becomes then, now what? And that will be part 2. The next video. Take care.